European issuers representing the interests of publicly traded companies in Europe, Susannah Haan, who was supposed to speak before lunch, but will now speak instead. And then after that, we have 3 presentations of something that we have not heard about yet today, and that is the alternative ways of organizing business. Because the company with limited liability for shareholders that we've all discussed up till this point is not the only way of organizing business, and we have a lot of interesting things to learn and important reflections from these different other ways of organizing business activities. So we will get to that. As you know, we are way behind time. So we will ask all presenters to stick within the 10 minutes. And for those of you who know me, you know that I'm very strict about time. So so let's stay friends. And we. And I know that the presentations will encourage questions and comments. Write them down or remember them and keep them. We will have a wonderful brainstorming session at the end. So now we're just going to have presentations, break, presentations, and then the brainstorming with including everybody. Okay, please go ahead, Susannah.
Thank you. So, as was mentioned, I represent European Issuers. We're a trade association here in Brussels for companies quoted on the public markets. My own background relevant to this session is that I've worked in various places, starting off as a lawyer, following this morning's debate, including looking at company law and corporate governance, later then with the CBI in the UK, it was British Business Association, then with Fidelity as an investor, then for the Financial Reporting Council on stewardship, and now at a European level in a trade association. So I guess what that has given me is a picture of companies from all angles, from dealing with the directors, the company secretaries, people within companies, dealing with investors looking at companies, and working on the regulatory side as well. And my conclusion, relevant to the discussion today, based on all of that, is that I'm afraid that I think that company law and corporate governance are mostly irrelevant. So I think, in that sense, the question about the purpose of the corporation is not a question of company law. I think there are some bigger picture issues that need to be thought about, and it's relevant to what Richard was saying as well, about the need to avoid silos and to think about many different areas. And company law and corporate governance are part of that, and economics is a part of that. But I think the biggest part of the issue, which is not on the agenda today for discussion, is actually how financial markets work. And that is a much bigger area and is one of the major sources of pressure on companies, and that area needs to be looked at as well. So my question there would then be coming more, do capital markets serve the needs of their end users? And if not, why not? And that brings me on to a second question about purpose. So if I don't think that we should be talking so much about the purpose of the corporation, what do I think we should be talking about? And I think there's a question to be asked about the purpose of European financial regulation. What is it supposed to achieve, and whose interests should financial markets serve? I've been involved in policy for a long time, and I wasn't quite involved at the time of the announcement back in 1998 for the Financial Services Action Plan, which was a big wave of European regulations to create a single, deep, liquid capital market, blah, blah. But what they said at that time was that they should create the deep and liquid capital markets which serve both issuers and investors better. So at the time of the launch of the big project on financial regulation for Europe, the goal, the purpose of the regulation was to serve the needs of the end users, being the companies and the investors. Fast forward back on to more recent times and to the current objectives set for ESMA, etc. And what do we have? We have the need for regulators to protect the public interest by contributing to financial stability and effectiveness of the financial system for the economy, citizens, and business. So now, companies and investors and citizens are right at the end of the line, And everything else comes first, including financial stability and the economy and kind of all the macroeconomic stuff, and the regulators and policymakers are kind of first in the queue. So I suppose my question would be, what have we created in the Financial Services Action Plan over the past few years? And my argument would be that the focus has been very much on secondary markets and on trading. This has implications for the pressures that are put on companies, for how companies react, for what we've discussed this morning around, maximizing shareholder value, the discussions that go on between investors and companies. So I think you can't look at company law in isolation. You have to look at regulation across the board. And if I look at what European regulation focuses on, and what we have measured over the past few years, I see, for example, that the European Commission has paid one of the economic consultancies a fair amount of money to do an analysis of the breakdown of the costs of an individual trade. So we know a lot about how much it costs to buy and sell a share. I haven't seen any information, any studies, any measurement done on, for example, how much it costs to buy and hold a share across Europe, and whether those costs are going up or down. So I think there's a question to be asked about the measurements that policymakers use to judge the outcomes of regulation, which has implications for how we design the markets in which we operate. And I think it's very important to look at the ecosystem as a whole. And so, as I say, not just company law, but also all the rest. And to think about what can be done. It's even more basic than that, because actually when you look at what regulators measure, in a lot of cases they don't have what I would call really good figures on who the issuers and the investors are. If you read through something like one of ESMA's annual reports, I wonder how many references you get to, real end companies and so on, and most of it, of course, is really tied up with their financial system. Of course, with a financial crisis, that's inevitable to some extent, but I think the debate has also been distorted. Someone mentioned this morning as well about the number of delistings that have happened in the major markets. I think, again, that's a question for the health of the market and a question for whether capital markets are actually serving the needs of companies if you think that their initial purpose was indeed to deliver capital from the investors to the companies, but companies perhaps, like Apple was mentioned, that you raise some capital at first, but then after that, do you really need the capital markets for money purposes? And if not for money purposes, then essentially it's quite an expensive form of financial communication. So I think the direction we've been looking at over the past few years in financial regulation has been on the reduction of costs, the creation of large liquidity pools to drive higher trading volumes, harmonization of national regulation, commercial focus on the participants who generate higher volumes, and the advantages on the whole tend to go to the larger participants, with lower costs perhaps for the system in terms of infrastructure, but higher costs in terms of tailoring to the needs of the individual users. What we lack is a focus on outcomes for the end users. So, for example, issuers might seek the following outcomes from capital markets around flexible access to capital, with the ability to list, delist, and move between markets, management of risks, clarity and transparency of ownership, dialogue with investors, accurate and easily accessible information on their shares and other financial instruments, clear distinction between client and proprietary assets in the investment chain, a nice amount of competition among service providers for the services that they provide to us, and transparency of cost. I would say that's not where we are now. It's a pity. And I think the debate on company law and corporate governance is quite often a distraction from the real problems that we face. And so I would encourage you to look further, and I think I'm going to have to stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Susannah, for providing that broader context for the listed companies of what is the purpose of the market. So there's a new conference there, I think, and then the purpose of the economy after that. Perhaps now we will move on to Klaus Niederlander, who's the Director of Cooperatives Europe, and hear more about the alternative ways of organizing business.
Okay. Thanks very much. And gosh, yeah, it's this afternoon session just after lunch. So while you're all digesting, I will try to tell a story maybe about the story of cooperation and a little bit also about the history of cooperatives. So hopefully I will manage to lure you a little bit away from your lunchtime thoughts and your mobile phones and iPads and all that. We'll see. I've just over lunch actually talked with someone about cooperatives and not cooperation, and that a lot of my members actually have difficulties with the word cooperative. Maybe for some because it's too close to cooperation, especially as Americans in cooperative, then it's very close to cooperation. And whereas for others it's actually something which they link to the past, something which is not really in today's times anymore. It's a thing that we have heard about 100 years ago. So I will actually start with a story, and it indeed starts a little bit time back, because I'm actually representing a movement of enterprises which has already been created 160 years ago. But you might find some interesting parallels and why it also still matters today. It actually started in Europe with a technical invention which actually later led to the Industrial Revolution. And as any revolution, it destroys parts of the old system, just as specific professions, power structures, social relationships, and also creates parts of a new system, like the industrial conglomerates at the time, the industrial barons as the new leaders, the fossil energy-based economy, new political systems with parties, upcoming democracy. And as any revolution, well, some win, some lose, or shall we rather say actually many more lose than win in a revolution. And usually those who kick off the revolution are the first ones to be eaten up. At the same time, a new working class emerged, what Ferdinand Lassalle called the fourth class. And these are the people who moved from the countryside into the growing industrial cities, Manchester, Liverpool at the time, and who worked under poor working conditions in factories and mines. So yeah, we're talking here about the mid-19th century, which actually was the birth period of the cooperative movement and the businesses in Europe. In 1848, the Rochdale pioneers near Manchester proclaimed their objective for their first cooperative enterprise, which was to provide quality food at affordable prices. Because poor people could not get quality food, they were being taken for a ride by the traders. So they took it in their own hands. And they created this cooperative, which obviously at the time was not a legally recognized enterprise form, because it was something new. So in order to fulfill their objectives, they created this business, and this was based on some clear purposes and principles. The principle of equal say, so that's where the one man, one vote, but also equal share, a share of joint economic benefits. They didn't call it profits, because a lot of time no money was paid out. It was basically you could buy your food at affordable price, so you could actually just pay less for something. It was also about social and cultural benefits. These pioneers developed a way of doing business which led later on to the establishment of what we call in the cooperative the 7 cooperative principles. These are the guiding principles for cooperatives on how to carry out the business, and which could say are the guiding stars of today 1 million cooperative enterprises around the world. And the fundamentals of these enterprises, it's a value-based business based on self-help, self-responsibility, and solidarity. Today in Europe, we count around 160,000 cooperative enterprises. And we say about every 5th European is a member of a cooperative, even if he's not aware of it. But a lot of them are not, but that's a fact. And cooperatives employ directly around 5 million people across Europe. So while the Rochdale pioneers in Manchester went on to their cooperative journey in the UK, we also had similar initiatives all around Europe in isolation, because we didn't have a globalized world at the time, but we had the Friedrich Wilhelm Raiffeisen and Schulze Delitzsch in Germany, we had cooperators in Italy, François Guidet in France, we had it in Russia, all developing in their own little environment, actually without knowing each other, not knowing what's going on. And it actually did not stop there. Next to these cooperative enterprises, the emergence of cooperatives was also closely linked with the rise of the two main political streams in Europe of the 19th century, which was on the one hand the socialist, communist, and social democratic movement, on the other hand the conservative, liberal, Christian democratic one. And actually a lot of cooperatives find themselves in there, which gets quite funny when you come to Italy. It's a little bit like Don Camillo and Pepone. You have the communist cooperatives on one side and you have the Christian Democrats on the other. So very different on the one hand, but very actually operating completely on the same principles. Because the cooperative model is about combining economic survival, or better even success, with social cohesion and solidarity, which is deeply enshrined into today's Europe's social market economies and welfare state. But let's switch to the present, because corporates sometimes have too much of a tendency to talk about the past. I like history, I'm not a lawyer, but we need to talk about the laws today here as well, because that's crucial. I think it's a crucial language which we as cooperatives had to adopt as well. We started first with cooperatives and adopted laws later on, which sometimes brought us into trouble with lawmakers, because they actually wanted to control cooperatives. And when the model is focused on autonomy and self-help, we prefer self-regulation rather than regulation by the state. In some cases, however, it proved worthwhile as well to propagate it. In today, just to give you a couple of figures, because I'm an economist, so we like figures, you like paragraphs. Just two things. Cooperatives today are around in about 90 countries around the world. It's probably one of the few European export models of that time, which was more successful than colonization or that. So you can actually still find it today in 90 countries around the world. The top 300 cooperative enterprises actually have a combined turnover in 2012, which is equivalent to the 8th economy of the world. At that time was Spain. So, and there are 3 times more cooperative members than their shareholders in the world. But there's also another reason, why experience matters today, which maybe didn't not so much 10 years ago. Do I still have a little bit of time? I heard the sound. It's okay?
No, that wasn't me.
Okay,
you
good.
have 4 minutes.
It's one of these iPhones. Okay. First, I think why we matter today and why we still are that strong, we are in the midst of an economic upheaval, which was triggered by another technological invention of the last 20, 30 years, which is the digital age. The second, this global economic and I think probably even more financial storm, which caused it all, has led to a deep social, environmental, and even political crisis in Europe and around the world, severely increasing social inequality, closing millions of young people the door to employment, prosperity, and the setup of their own families, and also creating millions of employed poor people while destroying our natural habitat and biodiversity. Another reason, while our socio-economic model in Europe is in deep crisis, which obviously also affects the cooperative enterprises, it is still alive and resisting. And actually, cooperatives have a little bit been rediscovered by our European institutions over the last 5 years, because we actually fared better during the crisis. We shed much less jobs, or not at all. We had no bankruptcies and state takeovers. And this is not surprising. It's a model which was born out of a crisis, so we are used to crises. And just like the Industrial Revolution led to the emergence of new types of business, such as cooperatives and mutuals 150 years ago, today I think we are seeing the same thing again. Ways to rebalance our let-loose economy by bringing back more social cohesion, impact, and solidarity. You have the social businesses in general, you have the community interest companies in the UK, the B corporations in the US, the whole social economy approach in France or Italy, to just name a few. Over those last few years, we've actually seen the creation of thousands of new cooperatives in new areas. In renewable energy, for example, where we have more than 2,000 new ones in cooperatives. In healthcare, in childcare, in education, in classical sectors like agriculture, but organic agriculture, cooperative housing. In Belgium, they're trying to do a new cooperative bank again after they have lost it and demutualized it in the 1990s. And they have 40,000 members who want to pay for it. So, in Europe, we have a European Cooperative Statute. So for your lawyers, we are also working on that. So we got more recognition. At the same time, we are working on a cooperative roadmap, because we need policies which follow. Otherwise, cooperatives will not develop. So I trust, to finish, that our cooperative experience here in Europe can contribute to the debate, The rethinking of the purpose of cooperation will certainly not stop with today's conference. On the contrary, it might just give it that extra kick it needs to mainstream the debate. So I'm very curious to hear about these other experiences. We are the old boy on the block, but I think we have some experience to share, a lot of things, new things to learn, and well, we certainly look forward to working with you together to kick some bottoms here in Brussels and around the world on the cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that invigorating speech, Klaus. We will now move across the dam and hear how we can be. Joh Montgomery, please.
Hello, everybody. I'm Joh Montgomery. I'm a corporate lawyer from California, and I'm going to tell you a love story. I've had a fabulous career. For 30 years, I was a corporate lawyer in Silicon Valley representing startup companies, and I've got a very different perspective on the corporation than has been expressed so far in this room. As a startup lawyer, I've represented over 500 startups, and I generally start out with the entrepreneur who's got a lot of passion and a lot of love for his or her idea. And what I've observed over the years is that I've essentially been a midwife to these ideas. And the entrepreneur comes to me with an abstract idea that exists only in the brain, and through a process of corporate alchemy, we take the corporate legal form and we transmute that idea into a living organism, which is a corporation. And what I've observed is that the founder of these companies is charged with a very sacred duty, and that is to charge the corporation with its spirit. And there's an animation that occurs at the beginning of every corporation that is magical and alchemical. And every corporation that I've represented has a different personality, a different set of values, a different purpose, and a different life force. And I've seen a direct correlation between the collective intelligence, consciousness, and conscience of that collective life form and that of the leader. Well, about 20 years ago, I started seeing a correlation between the words in the legal documents, articles and bylaws, and stock purchase agreements and corporate codes, and the expression of that corporate form. And I started wondering why directors and officers of my corporations, who in their private lives are generally all people of conscience. You know, they go to church, they go to synagogue, they're kind to their families, they contribute to the United Way, they're upstanding citizens. And I wondered why, when they got into the boardroom, the moral compass defaulted to maximizing shareholder value. And that is the default moral compass of every corporation on the planet. And it's, as we've heard this morning, that's not embodied in the law, but it's come into custom. And I started wondering, okay, how did the corporation come to lack a collective conscience? And in the United States, we are inheritors of the English common law corporate form. And in our revolution, we overthrew the king, but we kept the basic corporate form. And the external conscience function that was served by the king in terms of chartering the company or taking away the charter devolved into the legislature. And until 1811 in the United States, if you wanted to incorporate a company, you had to get an act of legislation. And typically the legislature would limit the life of the corporation to a period of time and prescribe the purpose to a very limited purpose, such as building a canal or a toll road. And a funny thing happened in 1811 when we had a tariff dispute with England over cotton. New York invented free incorporation and limited liability. And after 1811, any person in New York that could fog a mirror could incorporate a company without an act of legislation. And shareholders of corporations were no longer jointly and severally liable for the debts of the corporation. This did two things. It freed capital to flow into corporations, and it essentially spawned the industrial age, but it sundered the corporation from its external conscience. And as a society, we never replaced the external conscience function that was served first by the king and then the legislature with a replacement. Well, fast forward to 2010, in the United States, a movement came about to change the corporate form. There are 19 states that have adopted what is known as the benefit corporation, and the benefit corporation is the first legal corporate form that I'm aware of that creates the legal architecture within the corporation to support the manifestation of a social and environmental conscience in addition to the profit-oriented one that we're all stuck with. So what the benefit corporation does is essentially keep the existing body of corporate law and common law and make as few changes as possible. Because if you're going to change a system, you want to find a point of maximum effect with least amount of change, because the human being resists change like crazy. And so what we did in designing the benefit corporation legislation was identify in the corporate code where we could have the biggest impact with the least amount of change. And essentially, with 2 sentences in the corporate code, we change the manifestation of the corporate animal so that it starts to exhibit the beginnings of a planetary triple bottom line social and environmental conscience that transcends and includes the pecuniary one. So essentially, for example, the California Benefit Corporation is required to provide a material positive impact on society and the environment from its operations taken as a whole. And this is in addition to being a for-profit entity. So that's change number 1. The second significant change is that we change the fiduciary duties of the directors so that the duties flow not only to shareholders, but to all of the company's stakeholders, employees, vendors and suppliers, the communities in which the companies do business, and society and the environment. So with those 2 sentences in the corporation's code, we start to get very different behavior. We heard this morning about the lack of accountability in the system. One of the things we've tried to do with benefit corporation legislation in the United States is introduce transparency and accountability. So in California, a benefit corporation has to measure its provision of a material positive impact on society and the environment by using a third-party standard. And that third-party standard has to be independent. In other words, Chevron can't create its own standard and judge itself. So there are minimum standards. And there's an accountability provision, which is that the benefit corporation must provide a report annually to its shareholders as to how it's doing with respect to providing a material positive impact on society and the environment, and post that report on the internet. And in order to make this new legislation palatable, we've tried to minimize the liability to directors, because one of the biggest impediments, Beata talked about Milton Friedman's maxim being one of the biggest impediments to a sustainable global economic system. Well, lawyers are probably the second biggest impediment, because we are terrified of change, we're risk averse, and we've all drunk the Kool-Aid that the corporation exists solely to maximize profit for shareholders. And so in my experience in the boardroom, there's a lot of fear about change and about different fiduciary duties. So in adopting the California legislation, for example, we tried to make it really easy for directors to live in this new corporate form. And we limit the recourse for failure to provide a material positive impact on society and the environment to shareholders, and there are no monetary damages for failing to provide a material positive impact on society and the environment. We rely on the court of public opinion, and the increasingly conscious consumer to cause directors of these companies to behave. I think I will wrap it up there. That's my 10 minutes, and we'll leave room for questions. So thank you.
Thank you very much, John, for that inspirational talk. We will now move back again to Europe and hear from Marcello Palazzi, the co-founder and co-CEO of B Lab Europe.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much. I'm going to put some slides up, but before I do that, just a word of introduction. What is this benefit corporation? We heard John mention it. It's now a movement of about 1,000 companies, 965 exactly, in 32 countries. The United States is where it started. About 2.5 years ago, it moved quite quickly into South America. There are now nearly 200 companies in South America in 4 countries. It was launched in Brazil in October with nearly 1,500 people in a room. There are about 100 in Canada, 50 in Australia, New Zealand, and I, together with a partner, and with B Lab in New York, we started B Lab Europe about 6 months ago. We are now growing this movement in up to 45 countries in Europe. So John, very helpful. You gave me a lot of ammunition already to start with. I want to just give you a couple of highlights. The first one is, having listened to the conversation this morning, B Lab and this movement of B stands for benefit, it really emerges from the entrepreneurs, from business owners, and also from investors. In the last 15, 20 years, I've been active in business ethics, CSR, sustainability for nearly 20 years, and there's been an evolution of the entrepreneurs, the investors, particularly, who also wanted to change the system. They are human beings like we are, and many of them also feel that we want to work in an economy that benefits society, not that in a way subtracts from society, where we maximize the positive externalities and reduce the negative. And some of you are aware there are many more ethical investment funds today than there were 15 years ago. You can count 10, 15% of the money out in the world is invested according to some criteria. There are iconic companies like Ben & Jerry, Patagonia, Danone, and many others who have in a way led this movement to integrate entrepreneurship and values. Now, B Corp is basically a very nice tool. It's like a box where you put 200 criteria ranging from sustainability, social innovation, governance, diversity, ownership, you name it. I'll show you the slide, but it's on the internet. There is an assessment of these 200 criteria. And companies can do this assessment for free. It costs nothing to do the assessment. In Europe, we have received about 1,000 companies have actually gone online to do the assessment or start the assessment process. And we see a lot of energy all over Europe and beyond Europe, but speaking for you as a European now, for this kind of movement from the entrepreneurs up. Now, a few slides. This is Robert Shiller, winner of the 13 Nobel Prize in Economics. He's a champion of the Benefit Corporation. If some of you are interested, you can Google him and you will find a 20-minute video done in 2012 in which he talks about actually what kind of evolution this new corporate law can be for the economy as a whole. Second person, and this is very diverse, Jessica Alba, quite a well-known actress. She started a company called The Honest Company. As a young mother, she wanted consumers to buy products that kind of signified, honesty, the kind of motherly values. This lady, Jasmine Arons, she produces clothes in the slums of Santiago, Chile, sells them in New York. Very successful new small business. John Elkington, he has 2 companies, Sustainability and Volas. They're both B Corps. And he said it very clearly, for me, B Corp stand for profit, for purpose. He thinks, we can't solve the challenges of poverty, inequality, waste, energy without profit, because NGOs can't do all these things. So he is really a champion, and I think it's a very interesting model of why you can be profitable and have a purpose. Yvonne Chouinard, Patagonia, some of you may know the story. Patagonia, about $500 million company, a model of sustainability, of social engagement, of in a way consuming less and, keep your products as long as you can, et cetera, also B Corp. This lady, Maria Correa, Natura, is a Brazilian company, also, working in Europe and France, very much fair trade, working with the rainforest, et cetera, another example, and so on. But I wanted to give you some faces, because often in this discussion we miss the faces, the human beings behind these companies. These are some of the other logos of companies, some in the United States, some in South America. This is a wider logo showing more of these companies. Etsy, for example, is kind of an ethical eBay. It's about $1 billion company. Ben & Jerry, I was with Ben & Jerry Unilever in London. Unilever thinks Ben & Jerry is their coolest brand, which is now a $1 billion company. It's a B Corp. So these are kind of iconic companies. Method was acquired by Ecovert. Ecovert is a Belgian-French company, so it's also quite iconic. This is just a few pages showing you basically what the B Corp stands for. It stands for this, shift towards stakeholder capitalism. On the right-hand side at the bottom, you see this 100,000 social entrepreneurs, sustainable business. This is very important. I sat in actually in the bigger room at the European Parliament a year ago with about 600 people working on social business. So social business, social entrepreneurship is actually growing very fast in Europe. In the United Kingdom, the B Corp is run by Sir Rowan Cohen and the Big Society Capital, which is actually funding these kind of social businesses. So there is real movement behind the idea of combining social with entrepreneurship. This is what John alluded to this already. You can see there are two ways. You can become a certified business corporation, or you can also complete the assessment without legal changes. For example, John Elkington, whom I showed, he didn't change the legal statute of this company, but he passed a resolution by all the shareholders, that all the shareholders sat around the table and they sign a resolution that as shareholders they abide by the P Corp values without changing the statute. We have a couple of companies in Italy who basically pushed the legislation through the Chamber of Commerce 5 times, and they said, our company wants to create happiness in the world. They didn't understand, what is this? Company creating happiness? And basically they had to accept, because there was nothing in the law, as we heard this morning, that basically says you cannot run a company for happiness. So there are other ways of actually getting there without necessarily changing the legal form. B Analytics, there are about 150 investment funds that actually use the B Corp criteria to help investors identify those companies that actually have an impact in society. So it's a very important element in this mix. A few thoughts about why, and the kind of the themes that are driving these B Corps and how you actually assess by. So the assessment, when you take the second step, you actually have to be audited by an external audit. So it's not just filling in, 200 criteria. Issues of innovation, sustainable development, governance, social engagement, etc. And I must say, this is what we use in Europe. Also, companies that contribute, through their culture, or companies in the media that have a positive impact in society. So it isn't only social, environmental. It's also enterprises and business owners who want to. We have a cluster in the Netherlands of companies that work in emerging markets with fair trade, with clean tech. Some of them partner with public sector bodies. It's quite powerful what we can do from Europe in the emerging markets around the world with the right kind of business models towards, base of the pyramid, et cetera, et cetera. This is a snapshot of the continents where B Corp is growing. By the way, we have the biggest mobile company in Afghanistan, Roshan, is a B Corp. A leading design company in Lebanon has become a B Corp a few days ago. So we're getting all kinds of requests from people around the world to start B Corps. Declaration of Interdependence. When you actually do the assessment and you pass, you have to sign that you actually abide by this declaration, that basically, we are all connected in the world and we need to work systemically to affect change. And then, there are, I said 964 companies, but 15,000 actually have gone online and done the assessment. So for us, it's a very interesting database to have of showing, what all these companies, how they score with each other, et cetera, et cetera. Benefits for the individual company. We see that there are studies that show employees are much more satisfied. It attracts new investors. There are business schools in the US that would actually write off your student loan if you work for a B Corp. So trying to get MBAs to work for these kind of companies. And mostly I think it's this partnership with peers. I met a company in Argentina who says, well, if we can actually work with similar B Corps around the world, for us it's like a due diligence. You've done the work for us. We don't have to go and choose this company because you already know that we have already passed those tests. So it's a kind of networking and doing business with each other globally. Legislation, John talked about the states in the US. And then finally, building a new sector. Well, we are trying to map out what is the kind of economy we want in the future, and then choose those sectors like obviously clean tech, obviously public-private partnerships, fair trade, all the kind of positive dimensions of the economies where we are now inviting companies to become B Corps. So the final message is, I was thinking this morning, I think we're going to put together like a nomination sheets. And if any of you is interested and you have ideas about entrepreneurs whom you think should be nominated, just come to me and I have a brochure there and a business card, and then I'll send you a nomination sheet. And that's how we want to work. Find the entrepreneurs who really want to integrate these values, and then we'll see where we are in 2 or 3 years' time.